Hey, I'm Follygon, and in this video I'll be showing you how to color your 3D sculpts in 3 simple steps. This is the sculpt I'll be coloring today. I made this back in 2021 based on a 2D illustration from the artist Loish. If you're interested in painting skin, eyes, and hair, well, you're in luck. Make sure you stick around until the end of the video to get all my juicy tips, plus a bonus tip at the end that I know you'll love. I'm going to start this video by giving a basic painting demo to catch everyone up to speed and make sure we're all on the same page. I recommend watching this section for a nice refresher and some new tips you may not have known. But if you're already super familiar with painting, you can of course skip ahead using the timeline markers in the video below. You can also use these to return to previous sections more easily in the future. All right, let's get started with the demo. The first thing we are going to need to do is grab a sphere 3D. So let me go ahead and place her over on the side with a quick Shift S to screenshot her. And let's click up here and grab sphere 3D. I'll zoom in on that. And of course we need to click on Make Polymesh 3D just to make sure we can sculpt and paint on this geometry. If you want to grab a similar material to what I'm using, I'm currently using the ZBrush paint material. You can find this online for free, or if you'd like a similar material that's just in ZBrush by default, I recommend Skin Shade 4. Now, if you currently do not have any paint or material applied to your geometry, which we currently don't, and we can tell that because this icon is toggled off over here on the left, anytime we change the color or the material that we currently have selected, this will update on our geometry. So because nothing is applied, by default, it will use whatever you have selected. To fix this and also begin painting, we need to grab a paintbrush. Now, any brush that you have in ZBrush can technically become a paintbrush. I'm going to recommend that you use something that does not have an alpha. I'm going to be using my custom standard brush, but you can, of course, also use the default standard brush here in ZBrush. I believe they also technically have a paintbrush, which is absolutely fine to use. This is technically a standard brush as well, but use whichever brush you would like. The only thing that you need to make sure you do for your standard brush is turn off the sculpting feature. You can do that by clicking up here and toggling off Z add or Z sub, depending on which one is currently toggled. So once you toggle that off, make sure you select mRGB. This is a combination of the material and color channel, all in one selection. And then finally, just make sure that your RGB intensity is all the way on 100. I'll go ahead and click on Fill Object. And once I do that, you'll see that nothing will visually change here, but you can see that the paintbrush icon has turned on over here. So now if I change my color to something like red, or I change my material for instance, you can see over here that when I go ahead and paint, it will apply the newly selected color and material. I'll undo on that and instead go back to my ZBrush paint material and fill that in. The first and most important thing you need to know about polypaint is that polypaint is dependent on the resolution of your geometry. So I'll go ahead and make a brush stroke here, and you can take a look at our polyframe data to see our current resolution at about 8,000 active points. I'll scroll down and click on Divide. I'll make another brush stroke, and I'm doing this all with my mouse, by the way. I'll click on Divide. I'll do that again, and one more time here for one last final stroke. So you can see based on the resolution that I had these applied for the sphere, we go from more rough to a little more smooth in terms of the edge. I will also say, although hugely not important, that polypaint is a little bit of a misnomer because your paint is actually applied to vertices and not to your polygons. You can see how it gradates out from one piece over here, from this vert over here. So it's not technically applied to the polygon, it is applied to the vert, which can be helpful knowledge in more specific situations. If you're wondering how I'm swapping back and forth between my colors so quickly, you can use the V key on your keyboard as a default hotkey to swap between your two main selected colors. You can of course change one and then swap to another and pick a new color for both, and then easily swap back and forth between those two. Another really nice hotkey is the C key on your keyboard. You can hover over any color in your ZBrush scene and select that color. Not only can you select colors using the C key on your geometry, but you can also do that anywhere in your ZBrush scene, anything in a screenshot, so I can grab the colors from here, or in fact anything from your user interface, which maybe isn't the most helpful thing in the world, but is interesting nonetheless. And then as a final part of this demo, I'm going to show you something here when it comes to painting and also using subdivision levels at the same time. So once again, I'm going to paint on my subdivs, stepping up one at a time, And I'll use the D hotkey to step up through those a little more quickly. And let's take a look at our brush strokes that we have now. So the first thing you might notice is that we have a little more artifacting going on in the paint than what we had previously. You can see that we're getting, at the lowest resolution, some pretty random and strange dots. Let's go down here and change our material as well. So when I go ahead and change that, you'll see that we have some even stranger artifacting. If you remember from earlier, if we do not have poly paint or a material assigned to our object, it will default to whatever you currently have selected. So there's a lot of technical things going on under the hood here, but what you need to understand is that by painting at lower subdivision levels, you will disassociate some of the surrounding polygons currently applied poly paint as well as material, which is why this surrounding material is changing based on my currently selected material. So nothing is applied there. You can also see that the artifacting from the paint is also pretty drastic. So my recommendation for you, and something that I do myself, is only paint on your highest subdivision level. You can check that down here on your geometry, or you can simply hold down the D key to make sure that you're always at your highest level. This will prevent any of that artifacting happening, and it will also make sure that you keep your brush strokes as smooth and clean as possible. Okay, that is it in terms of our painting demo, so let's move on to our first tip in terms of creating gradients. Okay, let's go ahead and look at creating gradients now. You can see in my character that I have here that there are a number of gradients in the hair, on the front and back, as well as the sweater. And this helps to really easily create a lot of visual interest rather than just having a singular color filled in for the entire object. For this demonstration, I'll once again grab a sphere 3D and click on Make Polymesh 3D. Let's go ahead and fill in with mRGB, a simple off-white color, and then hold down Control, which is going to activate our masking tool, and we're just going to use the default mask pen. I'll control click and drag up from the bottom, roughly about halfway. And unfortunately, somewhere along the line, I accidentally adjusted the RGB intensity of my mask brush, which is very convenient for us because I can illustrate how to fix this. So you can actually affect the masking property of your mask brush and have it only apply slightly, which can be a little confusing if you're unaware of that interaction. So let's go ahead and hold down Control and make sure we turn that all the way up to 100, and it's working once again. Great. So control click and drag on our canvas, that will clear our mask, and let's just go ahead and reapply that. Control click and drag, there is our mask. Hit V on the keyboard to swap our color, and I'll just grab a nice red and click on Fill Object. Control click and drag to clear the mask, and there we have a top color and a bottom color. Now there are a couple different ways we can go about creating a gradient with this, including some pretty strange ways like using the smooth brush with RGB turned on. If you watched the painting demo from earlier, this can actually cause some errors with disassociating poly paint and material, so I don't actually recommend using this way unless you're on your highest subdiv. Instead, what I'm going to recommend is that when we create our mask, we now blur this. So you can achieve that in a couple different ways. The main way that you are most likely familiar with is by control tapping or control clicking to blur your mask. You can invert your selection and then blur it the other direction. However, this can be a pretty slow way to blur your mask. There is in fact a better way to do this, especially when we have higher subdivs. So let's go ahead and click on our geometry. We'll get up to a subdiv level of 4, and let's fill in our color with that off-white color here. Let's once again create a mask, and now if we control click and try to blur that, you'll see that the blurring is happening a lot slower. Not only that, but it's only blurring towards the direction of our mask. We can go ahead and invert that and sit here and click for a really long time, and then maybe fill in that color there. Let's clear our mask, and you can see a gradient starting to take shape here, very slowly though. So instead what we want to do is we want to scroll down here to the masking menu and find the blur mask option. So the reason why this option is better than control tapping is not only does it blur towards the direction of your mask, but it also blurs towards the direction of the unmasked geometry, creating a much more even blend. Another benefit of using this operation here is that you can hold down Control and Alt and click and set a hotkey for this button. I am using Control B, so I'll press Control B on my keyboard. It will tell me that that is already assigned here, so no need to reassign it. And now what you can do, instead of sitting here clicking a button infinitely, is hold down Control B on your keyboard. and we'll add in a lot of undos. You can see that growing really quick all the way up to 120 up here. So we just blurred that a ton of times, and you can see that it got us a nice, really even blur on our mask. So now all we have to do is click on Fill Object and clear our mask, and there we have a really beautiful gradient starting to take shape. Now, if you watch the painting demo, I mentioned that you never want to paint on your lowest subdivision levels. That is technically untrue. This is probably the only time I would ever suggest you should ever do that. So let's go ahead and make a mask here. I'll press Ctrl B and blur that out, and I will then apply that color. Now from here, if I step all the way up, you'll see that we get a lot of artifacting in this geometry. So what we want to do instead is go back to before we applied that and step up one of our subdivision levels and continue to blur this mask. So we'll get something a little more gradual. It's a little tough to see here probably with the resolution of my screen, but it is being affected. We'll step up one more time, Control B a few more times and blur that out. And then finally here on the last step, hold down Control B and just blur the absolute heck out of it. Okay, so let's click that, we'll fill it in, and now we're starting to get a really strong gradual gradient all the way from this red to this off-white color. And you can invert your mask if you want that to be a little less strong and do it on the other side. You can click multiple times to continue to grow that color. I'll just do it once here, just to get something that's really nice and even. And that's looking really great, and that's pretty much exactly how I created the effect that you can see over here on this character's sweater. As a final little extra tip here, you can also use your paintbrush with a really low RGB value, maybe around 5 to 15, somewhere around there, and very gently, with a large brush, come through and start painting to manually start adjusting and changing your gradient. Now this is a sphere, so we would need to maybe turn on radial symmetry or something similar to keep things a little more even, but I think you get the idea in terms of starting to clean things up in a more manual way. Over here on the sweater, I'll simply grab the two separate colors that I was using. I'll go ahead and fill in one here. That does have a quick hand-painted heart on the front, so we'll be getting rid of that temporarily. And let's just create a quick mask. You don't have to use the mask pen by default. There's a number of different mask brushes up here, like the mask lasso, which I'm a big fan of. We can blur that, step up our subdivs, and continue to blur until we hit a level that we are comfortable with. Apply that, and just like that, we have very quickly gone back through and applied that gradient to the sweater. And that is the exact same technique that I used for all of the pieces of hair that you can see on her head. Okay, next up, let's look at painting eyes. There's a lot of different things going on with the eyeball shape and the geometry here, and I'll explain every single step here for this process. To begin, let's once again grab a Sphere 3D. You can reuse the one you had before, but I'll just go ahead and grab a fresh one. And of course, make Polymesh 3D. I'm going to rotate to the side and just make sure that my sphere is pointing towards the camera. So I'll start rotating this and then hold down Shift and snap that to 90 degrees. So now when I look at that, that point or vert right here is facing directly toward me. This can be a little tough to do with perspective on, so make sure you toggle that off first. Now the reason why it's important for this point to face forward is so that we can mask off our pupil/iris. So you can do this very easily in a number of different ways. However, I'm going to recommend that you hold down Control and swap back to your default mask pen brush. And then from the side, as long as you're holding down Shift, it'll snap the camera. And of course, if you want to see your polygons, you can turn on Polyframe. And we're just going to mask off the front portion of our sphere. Now we don't want to mask off too much, maybe about right there. From the front, what we want is the distance from the point here in the front, this vert, to the edge of our sphere. We want the mask to be roughly halfway. And it looks like we did a pretty good job of getting that on the first try, so I'm pretty happy with that result. I will then press Ctrl W on my keyboard. Ctrl W is the hotkey to turn any mask into a polygroup. This is going to be helpful later so that we can quickly select this geometry and adjust it. Next, let's do one more. From the side, mask, and we're going to now be creating the section for our pupil. That's a little too large, so I can shrink that in a number of different ways. I think what I'll do is Control Tap to blur my mask, and then Control Alt Tap to sharpen my mask. And by doing that a couple times, I can essentially shrink the shape of my mask. I'll press Control W again, and there we can see that we've gone about half this distance. I'm using the transpose line to measure that, although you can eyeball it, excuse the pun. And now we have everything set up for our eyeball to make painting this incredibly easy. So I'm going to recommend in terms of material that you use the toy plastic material. This is a default ZBrush material that has a nice specularity to it. I'll select something that's not exactly pure white, but maybe slightly off-white, and go ahead and fill that in with mRGB. Now let's take a look at our geometry and get the shape of our eyeball to be a little more accurate to real life. We're not going for hyperrealism here, so it's going to be a little more stylized and simplified, but the basic shape will help get our specular reflection in the correct place. So either with the 3D gizmo or the transpose line, Control tap on your outside polygroup. So what this will do is it will mask off everything except for that selected polygroup. That's very helpful now because we can simply Control click and invert that selection. And from the side or from the bottom, it doesn't matter which, using your transpose line or 3D gizmo, you want to draw out your line and grow this section forward slightly. So this is going to create the lens of our eyeball. To do this with the transpose line, if you've never used this before, just toggle off the 3D gizmo, take your transpose line and click, drag forward and hold down the Shift key. This will snap it into the vertical axis. Then making sure that move is selected, all you have to do is grab this end circle and start to pull it, like so, and hold down Shift once again. So when you hold down Shift, you just pull it forward a little. It's not going to be a ton. And there we create the basic shape of our lens. I'll maybe pull that forward just a little more, something like that. All right, we'll clear the mask, and now we can begin painting. To begin painting, let's add some resolution to our sphere. I'll press Control D on my keyboard or add in a few subdivs. 500,000 or 2 million polys, whatever you want to use, whatever your computer can handle. It's not really a huge deal either way. Let's Control tap, and we're going to fill in just this middle section. So we're using our poly groups. Remember that you can Control tap and select those very easily with your 3D gizmo. What we want to do is we want to select this one and invert and just fill in this intersection here. So now we can kind of pick and play around with whatever color we want to fill in for our eye, maybe purple, blue, green, whatever you are feeling. But first I'm just going to fill in a dark color that's not exactly black, but somewhere a little close. So just somewhere down here in the bottom corner. Doesn't really matter what hue you select. Go ahead and choose whatever you would like. So if you're painting blue eyes, which I'll play around with here at first, maybe you want to use that darker blue color. Okay, from here, let's grab something roughly in the middle, and all we're going to do is with our paintbrush, start filling this in. Now by default, this is going to be really strong with your paintbrush. So when you start pushing that in, you don't want to fill it in all the way. If you're having trouble like I am here, I recommend lowering your RGB intensity. I'm going to put mine at about 15 and just gently start filling in this bluish color right down here at the bottom. Now, if you have already gone through the gradient section, this might look pretty familiar. We're starting to get kind of a gradated effect, which is very nice. And we can play around with that even more, maybe a little brighter, a little more saturated up towards that right corner, down here at the bottom. And if you want to see how that's looking, you can, of course, clear your mask by Control clicking and dragging. And that's already starting to look really nice. So I'm a big fan of that. Let's maybe go back to that darker color. If you want to try to guess and select, that's fine. But remember that you can always press the C key on your keyboard to select any color under your cursor. And then with that color selected, I'm just going to very gently right here at the top, fill in a tiny amount of that. So the shape that I'm attempting to get down here is going to be a little more U-shaped in terms of that highlight selection. If I can change my mask brush really quick. So something a little like that for the highlighted shape here at the bottom. All right, let's clear our mask, and now what we're going to do is select that middle poly group. If you can't see it, make sure you turn on polyframe, Control click. That looks a little large to me. If you want to shrink that down, you can do that pretty easily by, remember, Control clicking to blur your mask, and then Control Alt clicking to sharpen your mask. I'll press Control W just to clean that up, and reselect my mask piece there. All right, so now we can fill that in. You can use a pure black color, or if you want to use that dark color from earlier or something a little darker, that is absolutely fine. I'll use something a little darker with mRGB up here set to 100, and I'll click on Fill Object. Now, one thing that you want to avoid here is getting too sharp with your edges, so what I'll actually recommend is that you blur your mask ever so slightly, maybe just once or twice, and click on Fill Object. You can, of course, blur your mask by control tapping or using the masking feature that we looked at earlier down here for Blur Mask. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you very quickly go through and paint an eyeball. And that is the exact same technique that I used here for this character's eyes. Now, there actually is one additional step that you can add on top of this that I find to be really helpful and create some extra visual interest, but we can look at that later on during our bonus tip. For our third and not so final tip, remember there's a bonus tip coming up here at the end, so stick around. We are going to be looking at clown paint. This is a technique of my own creation that I utilize to paint skin. I'll show you how to do this on the character's face in just a moment. It's how I paint all of my character's face, but first let's start off with a sphere 3D. So grab that one more time and click on Make Polymesh 3D so that we can go ahead and paint on that. If you'd like, add in some subdivs to make your paint a little more smooth and clean. And let's fill in maybe just an off-white, orangish, reddish color. So somewhere here in the top left. Just a really basic white skin tone. I'll even hit X on my keyboard to activate symmetry to mirror the effects that we would have if we were painting a face. Let's next grab a bright red color somewhere around here. And let's start painting and filling that in. So this would maybe be a blush or the warm area around your character's cheeks, and we would start applying that. You would probably also have some more yellowy areas of your character's face, and if you're familiar with the warm and cool zones of the face, then you would most likely also have some blue areas, typically down around the jaw and chin line. This can also be used to represent areas where you would expect there to be facial hair. So this is kind of the basic bands of the face. We have yellow, red, and blue. And this is the magic of the clown painting technique. Now we grab our base skin tone and we start to fill that back in over top. Now we don't want to fill that in all the way completely because it erases all of our work. So instead what we do is we go up here to the RGB intensity slider and we lower that. So this is 100% fill. If we were to set this to around 50, that would be a half fill. So we would be knocking that back by half. If we set this to something like 10 or roughly somewhere around there, I'll undo. And we can click this and fill it in about 10% of that color. So clicking this a few times, we can start to knock it back further and further and further until we get to a place where we're happy with the result. That is still probably a little exaggerated. So now let's go ahead and go back here to our character to look at an actual example with painting on this character's face. So to begin, I'll just simply fill in one solid color, and now you can see what that face looks like without any variation whatsoever. Next, I'll go over top of that and start filling in some paint. I'll start with an RGB intensity, maybe around 55, and I'll just start filling in some of the warmer sections around the nose, the cheeks, the lips, etc. I'll use an even stronger, brighter red here, so we can really exaggerate this clown painting technique. Maybe we have some more warmth around the eyes. Around here, I mentioned that we have often some more yellowy areas here at the top of the face, around the forehead, and that is because of bony landmarks being closer to the surface of the skin. So anywhere you might have that, maybe around the cheekbones a little, but that can kind of fight with and contrast with some areas of the warmth of the cheeks. And we'll just go through here and kind of clown paint that up a little. Now with feminine faces or more feminine faces that lack facial hair, you often want to go pretty subtle when we're talking about this blue band or blue section around the area of the chin strap, or where you might normally expect a beard to be. Because even when knocked back, that bluer color can really shine through and start to make it look like your character has a beard. Now, if that is what you want and the effect that you want to achieve, that is absolutely fine. But just be aware that that can happen. And if you are not going for that, it can be a little frustrating, and I recommend just avoiding that blue band altogether, or rather just being pretty subtle with it. Okay, so there is our initial layout. It looks pretty strange. It's our clown painting pass. So now let's grab a base skin tone, something that we started with, maybe around here, and let's start filling that in. So I'll set my RGB intensity maybe to around 15 or so, and we'll just click on Fill Object once, twice, 3 times, and very quickly, we're starting to knock that back into a pretty good spot. So now we're starting to get some more subtle variation in the skin tone, and we're having some of that shine through a little more strongly than we may like. So now we can do another pass and continue to clean that up. So I really enjoy this darker red color, this more reddish purple that we had earlier. So let's go back through. I'll add in a little more of that around the nose and around the face, up here through the cheek. I don't like that the yellow is kind of competing around this area, so I'll knock some of that back. And for the lips, let's just do something a little darker here. So I'll start filling that in here. And I'm not really looking up here in terms of reference. I'm trying to do something completely new here. And if you're interested in my geometry, like my mouth, for instance, you can see that I do not have a mouth bag for this character. The geometry here is actually Z-remeshed entirely using polygroups to create some cleaner form. If you're interested in learning how to do that, I have some tutorials over on my online store specifically for this character that illustrate that process. Okay, I'm really starting to like that effect. Although, we're still in that clown paint phase, so we'll have to knock this back in just a moment. Let's start with a wide band right through this area. More red, more warmth. I'm really liking that. All right, now let's knock that back one more time. So RGB intensity, 1, 2, 3, and maybe one more, 4 clicks. And that is actually looking pretty close to, one, what I had previously, and two, the natural skin tone that we have for the rest of the character. So we could play around with that more and add some more warmth or some more areas there, but I'm really happy with that result. I could even step back if I want to press Control Z and get something more saturated or more close to that brighter color that I had before. Maybe something like that, maybe a little less. So you can play around with it and experiment, but that is the basic process for how you go about painting skin using my clown paint technique. Okay, I mentioned earlier when we were on the eyes that I have a really fantastic bonus tip for all of you that is applicable to not just eyes, but skin, hair, and everything else that you can play with. And this is an idea called hand-painted shadows. If you are unfamiliar with this technique, it is a way that you can go through on your 3D characters and begin to emphasize areas of shadow. Some areas that you can apply this to on your character's face, for example, would be areas like underneath your nose, your upper lip, underneath your brow, underneath the chin, anywhere where light might have trouble reaching. Now, you do want to be extremely careful with this technique, I should say, because it's very easy to overdo it and have it compete with the actual lights in your 3D scene. So it's best to keep this technique being a little more subtle. The way you go about applying this technique is grabbing the color from an area, let's say our lips, and I like to darken and saturate just slightly towards the bottom right corner. So I've done that, and then with a low RGB intensity, I'll go through and start painting on that area. So I'm going to paint on this upper lip, and I'll hide everything. If you're unsure how I'm hiding that very quickly, I have a hotkey set up to this solo mode button down here, which is very handy, and I'm just darkening that a little. Remember that the best way to do this is to keep things a little more subtle, and that really helps to create some contrast between that upper and lower lip. And just for a before and after, maybe we can step back and forward, and I really like that contrast that we're getting there. Okay, let's now grab something up here in the eye, and I am really liking this red that we have here in this area. So let's grab some of that. And again, if you're being too heavy-handed with this, it starts to get back into that clown paint area. So let's try an RGB of 5. Just something really gentle. And I'll just fill that in. A little before and after, or maybe a little too much in that reddish spectrum. So let's go a little more blue. I'll undo on that. Let's fill that in. That dark blue. Let's go less saturated as well. Somewhere around there. All right, so some subtle shading starting to happen around that area of the brow. Fill in some of that under the other brow as well. And again, another area that you can start applying this to are areas like your jawline. So helping to frame, if you have a more feminine character, you will often have a character that has a more soft jawline, not always the case, but if you have a soft jawline and you don't want to emphasize that jawline with geometry, you can emphasize it instead with paint. And again, even with this technique here, you can go back through and use some clown pass ideas or techniques that we looked at in the previous tip to start knocking that back. You don't only have to knock it back with that fill object button, you can also sample some paint in some area, and with a low RGB intensity on your paintbrush, start to soften and blend out some of those areas. So maybe here for the bridge of the nose, maybe we went a little too heavy-handed on that under portion of the brow. Maybe you want to get back in some of the more white area here of the upper lip, just very gently. If you go too heavy-handed, of course, just sample that color of the cheek and paint right over top of it once again. And there's a lot of back and forth that you can have with this technique. The other area that I mentioned that's really helpful to apply this to specifically is the eyeball. You can get some really nice extra depth in your eyes by adding some shading, and you can do that specifically with the mask lasso brush. So control click, grab the mask lasso, and all you need to do, we'll do it only to one eyeball so we can kind of compare, is swipe your mask and frame the shape of your eyelid, that top eyelid. So I'm framing that, creating something roughly like this shape here. And I'll just make sure I mask off the entirety of that bottom section. And if you remember from our gradients that we created earlier, you can blur that by holding down Control B or using the blur mask function down here. I'll make sure that I do this on some lower subdivs as well, just to blur that out really nicely. That looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. And let's fill in, maybe we'll try 55% on pure black. So let's click. And of course, we have the incorrect material selected. So let's select toy plastic. Oh, we applied it over here as well. Let me mask that off. I just want to apply it up here. Click, there we go. Let's clear our mask, take a step back. And now we can see that we're starting to get some of that shaded depth from the top of the eyeball over here on the right versus the left. Now, I am in particular a really big fan of this type of effect. I think I blurred it a little too much here. So if we wanted, we could step back and sharpen our mask back up and try blurring it to a more appropriate level, somewhere maybe around there. You can really have some fun and play around with this idea. If you want to get a more sharp line, you can play around with that kind of effect. I think it'd be a little more gradated than this, somewhere more in between the two that I had there previously. That looks pretty good, somewhere around there. And of course, you can play around with the amount that you had. So like I said, I'm a big fan of this, but this illustration in particular did not have this effect, so I wanted to remain true to it, which is why you can see that I don't have it applied to the character over here on the left. Awesome, well I hope you found this video helpful. This is just scratching the surface on my knowledge, so if you want to learn everything I know about digital sculpting, check out the Appeal Academy or my online store at the link below. And if you like this video, check out this one where I give you 5 tips to become a working professional artist from zero. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.